This is FRM Part 2, Book 4, Liquidity and Treasury Risk Measurement and Management, and the chapter on Liquidity and Reserves Management, Strategies and Policies. This is the second chapter in a row that we have read from the Rose and Hudgens textbook called Bank Management and Financial Services. And I found this chapter fairly interesting for one perhaps kind of silly or odd reason. Inside of the chapter, there are boxes that the authors called factoids. And one of the factoids in there was that, did you know that bank robberies are increasing in recent times? But what I thought was even cooler was there were a couple of filmtoids. And there's a reference to a couple of films that relate to bank liquidity. You guys know that I'm a big fan of movies, and I use James Bond and The Terminator and Jaws examples as often as I can. So I encourage you to go read those. This is a chapter that's about the same length as the last chapter, so it's about 30 pages. But there still are only 5 learning objectives. A couple of good ones in here. Notice there's a calculate, and notice there's an estimate. And so we're going to go ahead and need some adding and subtracting. The calculations are not too complex. But notice that first learning objective. I think this one's really important. The net liquidity position. And then we're going to have to explain some factors. Then we'll compare strategies. Then we'll look at 3 different methods, and we'll go ahead and look at a big box, and I'll show you how to estimate a bank's liquidity using those 3 methods. Then we'll talk about reserves. And then the last slide or two, we'll look at some factors that affect the choice between and among the alternate sources of reserves. So let's start with just a brief recap of what we talked about in that previous chapter. And so this is a really simple slide. A financial institution is considered to be liquid if it has an adequate amount of immediately spendable funds at hand when required. And maybe there should be an and or in there, it can raise liquid funds quickly by borrowing or selling assets. Even if a bank or a financial institution is solvent, it can still be considered to be in financial difficulty if it lacks adequate liquidity. All right, let's go ahead and attack that first learning objective. Net liquidity position. So note the word net in front of those other 2 words. So net means that we're going to have to subtract some stuff. And so notice the difference between the green and the maroon, right? Supplies of liquidity. So think about what that means. Deposits coming in from customers, revenues, loan payments, sales of assets, and money market borrowing. So this is a source or a supply of liquidity. And then demand for liquidity by our customers and our clients. And the right-hand side of the balance sheet, so deposit withdrawals, borrowing repayments, any dividends that we pay to shareholders, acceptable loan requests, and then there's some other operating expenses in there as well. So think about that net liquidity position as really the difference between, okay, how much do we owe in the short term versus how much do we own in the short term, and then how much can we borrow in the short term. And when I say owe there, I'm looking at the side on demand for liquidity. Clearly, we owe the borrowing repayments to our bondholders and our note holders and any other creditors. We don't really owe dividend payments, but you need to make certain that you think about these not in the traditional kind of a corporate finance sense of owing, but those dividend payments, they're not liabilities to the shareholders, but we still owe them something. And of course, the shareholders, most shareholders would rather buy low and sell high on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, but there are lots of shareholders that like that dividend payment. All right, let's take a quick example of a net liquidity position. So once again, we have green and maroon. And so we've listed, just a few of those accounts. And so you can sum those in the green And look right below the table, what does that sum to? 931. So those are cash inflows. And then in the maroon, cash outflows, you can sum those, and I guess you get 613. So net liquidity position is $318 million. And so here in this slide is really just a mathematical example of what we have in that previous slide. Now, of course, look at the note at the bottom. We can have a liquidity deficit, in which case additional funds must be raised, or we can have a liquidity service, and we can then invest those excess funds, or, however we want, right? And we'll talk about some of those methods here in just a minute. How about strategies for managing liquidity needs? All right, so let's call this first one asset liquidity management. What this simply means is let's go ahead and pretend that we have a left-hand side of the balance sheet and they're filled with extremely liquid assets. And notice the bottom of that first box there, typical assets, Treasury bills, CDs, repurchase agreements, any highly liquid asset. And so what we're going to do is we're going to maintain liquidity through liquid assets. In other words, when someone shows up at our front door and says, I want my money back, whether it's a creditor or whether it's a depositor, we'll just have to say, hold on, please, let me sell that Treasury bill. Here's your money. As opposed to liability management strategy, in which what we're going to do is when that person shows up at our door and says, hey, I want my money, we'll say, hold on a second, and we pick up the phone and we call somebody else and say, hey, can you lend us this money? I have a creditor who's standing at my front door. All right, so what are these sources? We can issue jumbo CDs to raise money that's, kind of locked in so we don't have to worry about it. Repurchase contracts as well. The textbook mentions central bank borrowings, but remember from your economics days, the Fed, financial institutions consider the Fed to be the lender of last resort. We don't really want to go there. That's why, notice in the what's that? The second one I have in there, federal funds. So we'll just go to borrow from other banks. And then how about if we have a balanced liquidity management strategy, assets and liabilities, which is kind of a combination of what we just described. So look at this double-edged strategy. There's the word combines, the use of liquid asset holdings and the use of borrowed funds. This one is a little bit more complex. Notice the second block point that we have there to work. The bank has to plan and anticipate all of its short-term and long-term funding needs. And so remember, it was just a few recordings ago where I spent a moment or two talking about expectations and the skill set to be able to anticipate. What does that mean? We'll see a slide in a couple of slides here. Anticipate means not only anticipating what's going on inside the specific financial institution's balance sheet, but look at all the exogenous stuff that's going on in the economy. And so remember, there's correlations between what goes on inside of a financial institution and the larger macro economy outside of it. Now remember, correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation, so we're not quite sure which way the correlation is flowing, but clearly we need to be experts on economic conditions, and we need to be experts inside of the financial institution to be able to effectively anticipate. This should be an obvious slide. Why is this important, estimating a bank's liquidity needs? Deficits would compromise a bank's smooth operations, right? And surpluses would imply a suboptimal use of resources. And so in that second one there, I always tell my corporate finance students that means we call that underinvestment. So how do we manage these liquidity needs? And let's look at three different approaches, right? So sources and uses of funds. All right, this first one is a focus primarily on the expected changes in deposits and loans. We've said this before. What does a commercial bank do? That accepts deposits and makes loans. So just think about, let's think about the top portion of the right and left-hand side of a financial institution's balance sheet, which then has implications. So look at that second block point. Liquidity rises as deposits increase and loans decrease. But what do we want to do? I mean, we like lots of deposits, right? We want to have people coming in and depositing their capital every single day of our life. And we want to take that and we want to lend that out, probably in the longer term. All right, so notice there's a trade-off. I always tell you guys, I always tell my children, every decision, marginal cost, marginal benefit, and that leads you right into the second circle point. Of course, the opposite holds true. Liquidity decreases when deposits decrease and when loans increase. And so look, you have this money flowing in on the top right portion of the balance sheet, and you're immediately tempted. Of course, you're tempted, and shareholders are pressuring you to be tempted to lend that out at the highest possible interest rate, and maybe for the longest time period. Doesn't necessarily have to be that longest time period. All right, so you're managing, this is a maturity management issue. So let's identify this liquidity gap, the size of the difference between sources and uses of funds. So of course, there can be a positive liquidity gap or a negative liquidity gap. We just called those surpluses and deficits on a previous slide. Now, how do you go about using this particular approach? Well, let me go back to that previous slide. What was that key word there? Anticipate. So forecast loans and deposits for a given planning period, and then calculate those estimated changes in loans and deposits. And down there in the bottom box, there's a good old formula for you. Now let's talk about how are we going to anticipate, how are we going to forecast or estimate these changes in loans and deposits. And so we've got maroon there and green on the right. And so I want you to think about your life as a highly skilled financial risk manager who is in charge of estimating a bank's liquidity needs. I want you to look at these things and see exactly what kind of areas of expertise that you need to have. And when I say areas of expertise, what I mean is that, of course, as a good financial risk manager, you're going to know a lot of this stuff, right? But you're also going to have really smart men and women in your office that are going to be able to help you, fill in the gaps, right? We're not ever asked to be experts in every field, but we're asked to make expert decisions when they arise by using the resources that are available to us. All right, so I want to group some of these people that we're going to rely on into ourselves, right? Financial risk managers, and then maybe economists, maybe some individuals who have a good finance background. How about if I say these people hold the Chartered Financial Analyst designation? And then some really smart marketing people. All right, so let's just go through these here. Change in total loans, projected growth in the economy, growth in the money supply, estimated rates of inflation. Well, that sounds like we're going to rely on economists to help us make those decisions. How about projected quarterly corporate earnings? Well, those are financial managers or financial analysts, as well as probably that projected prime loan rate minus the CD rate. We'll probably rely on all of those people, right? Some economists, some investment people, and our other risk managers on that left-hand side. And then, of course, over on the right-hand side, growth in personal income, growth rate in the money supply, estimated rate of inflation. So those are all economics topics. But look at the second one there, estimated increase in retail sales. So we need to know something about, P times Q, retail sales. So boy, we're going to rely on marketing people to help us there. And then the projected yield on money market deposits, that's probably a combination of different skill sets. In fact, projected prime loan rate, CD rate, projected yield on money market deposits, and then maybe some other yields that are out there. Boy, we're going to use one of those great models. How about that Cox-Ingersoll-Ross model to estimate an interest rate path? How about a quick example here? So let's do this over a 6-month period, January to June. So in green, we've got the total deposits. In maroon, we have the total loans. And remember, these are estimated, right? So these, and also remember that we're probably going to be able to estimate January much more accurately than we can estimate June. Remember, there's that greater degree of error when that estimate gets farther into the future. And so all we're going to do then is take the change in that bottom table. And so notice that sometimes deposits go up and loans go up, and sometimes they go down. And so look at the orange column down on the bottom right. So this is really what we're trying to do, estimate a bank's liquidity needs. So in that orange column, notice we have some deficits and we have some surpluses. Second approach is called the structure of funds, and this is a scenario under which the bank's deposits and maybe some other funds are split into categories based on their estimated probability of being withdrawn, right? So if I show up at a financial institution and I say, hey, here's some of my money. I probably don't need it anytime soon. Just put it somewhere safe. I may need it. All right. As opposed to, let me go back to my movie example. How about James Bond in that great movie, License to Kill? He shows up with, multiple big old silver suitcases of cash. And he shows up in some other country and he says, hey, I want to deposit this. And the bank accepts his deposits. And there's a casino down below. So he's going to gamble all this money. So if you have, if I come, you're pretty confident that you'll be able to loan that money out. But if James Bond shows up with suitcases full of money, knowing he's going to gamble, now you may be able to keep that if he loses all that, or he may win and he may show up the next day and say, I want to withdraw, which in fact is what he does, for those of you who know that movie. All right, so let's look at these categories. Hot money liabilities. Notice in parentheses, volatile liabilities. So up and down, up and down. And they are very interest rate sensitive. Vulnerable funds and then stable funds. So I would be the stable fund, right? And then James Bond would be the hot money liability. And so look at the box down at the bottom. These are kind of maybe standard percentages, but they don't have to be 95 and 30 and 15, right? They can be almost anything that would be unique to that financial institution. So let me show you how this works here. Let's suppose that we have 50, 60, and 100 in hot money, vulnerable funds, and stable funds. There's a legal reserve requirement of 2.5%. So what's our liquidity requirement? And so you can look at the math in the box down there. All we're going to do is really take those percentages. All right, so desired reserve percentages, 95, 30, and 15, and multiply them by those total amounts. Now remember, you got to take out the 2.5%. So if you look inside of the brackets, we've got the 50, 60, and 100, subtract out that 2.5%, and then multiply by that amount. And there you get, what is that? Nearly 110 million of a liquidity requirement. And then how about a liquidity indicator approach? This is much more consistent and much more friendly with those in your office who hold the Chartered Financial Analyst designation. Look at this. Banks use various ratios as indicator. And we look at, whenever you do ratios, that ratio tells you something in and of itself. But in order to get a total picture, you have to look at trends, right? Let's go back over the last 3 years or 5 years, pick a number. And if you're doing quarterly, whatever that is, trend analysis is important. And then you have to look around and say, okay, what are the banks that look like we do? What kind of ratios do they have? And so notice the very end of that second block point to determine the acceptable position. So always remember, no matter what kind of ratios you're looking at, you look at the ratio in and of itself. You compare its trend over time, and then you compare it to the competition. And here is a good list of some liquidity ratios, so cash position indicator. So look at this one. Cash and deposits due divided by total assets. I mean, that sounds like a classic definition of liquidity. And then you can just go through all these different lists and different items on each side, the blue and the purple. And as you look at these things, you might say to yourself, you know what, if I were trying to use ratio analysis to estimate liquidity needs, I would clearly compute a bunch of these numerators and a bunch of these denominators. And notice that what most of these accounts are, you're looking at left-hand side of the balance sheet versus right-hand side of the balance sheet. Please read the note at the bottom. Notice we put that there for a really good reason. The textbook emphasizes this, and this sounds like a great exam question. Remember, I tell you this, when I make up exams, I always like to make up a part A and a part B. Now, I know you guys can't have that, but so you ask the candidate to go ahead and compute a ratio and then say, okay, what about sensitivity to things like, business cycle or, time period of the year, or maybe some other sensitivities? So make certain that you're aware that let's go ahead and do these quarterly or maybe monthly so that we can group them into, a fall season or a spring season or some other kind of seasonality, or as it relates to the business cycle. Now, remember that the financial institution industry does not operate in and above and among and between itself and customers. There's always somebody else out there, like a government. And so the federal government comes in and says, you know what, if you accept $10 in deposits today, you can go ahead and lend out $9 or $7 or $4. Remember, the governments, authoritative bodies and regulatory bodies, they get to make the rules. And so that first block point, I'll just go ahead and read that to you. Legal reserves, the assets that a central bank requires institutions to hold as a reserve behind their deposits and other liabilities. All right, so lagged reserve accounting. This is the current legal system. And this considers both vault cash and Federal Reserve deposits. I mean, it doesn't make sense to have a local financial institution to keep all of this in cash. I mean, that would be a sign outside saying, hey, we have $1 billion in cash. Let's go back to that one factoid that the authors told us about. Bank robberies are increasing. All right, so notice the third block point. The portion that is not met by vault cash is called the reserve balance requirement. All right, so we've got a computation period, which is a couple of weeks, and then a maintenance period is another couple of weeks. And so we thought that the easiest way to explain this to you is just put together a calendar. And so notice that we're beginning on a Tuesday and ending in the following Monday, the second following. So there you start on the 10th. And you end on the 23rd. That's called the lagged computation period. And then you start on the Tuesday, the 24th. You go all the way to that second Monday, which is the 6th, which is called the vault cash computation period. And then you have a couple of buffer days, and then you start that same time period of a window, but it goes from a Thursday to a Wednesday, the reserve maintenance period. Now let's address that learning objective where we have to calculate required legal reserves. And so notice we have maroon and purple there again. And let's go back to my example. What did I say? $10 in deposit. If the reserve requirement is 10%, then I need to keep $1 in cash on the top left of my balance sheet. Now let's go back to that James Bond example. Boy, I wish I would have seen that movie lately so I knew exactly how much he deposited in that bank. I don't remember what it was. Let's just suppose it was $4 million or some amount. So you don't really want to have to keep it on that 4 million or the 10, but maybe some average. So look in there, in both the maroon and the purple, the daily amount of net transaction deposits over the daily average amount, over that computational period. So we're going to smooth that so that we don't have to hold tons of money on a good day and then not so much on a different day. So the first two block points, this should be obvious. So we have a reserves surplus and a reserves deficit. Let's go ahead and look at a quick example here. let's suppose that here we are in the U.S., right? So the U.S. authority tells us that up to 12.5 million, we don't need any reserves, but 12.5 to 75, that's the next 62.5 million, right? That's 3%, and then over 75 million is 10%. So remember, for large banks, you got to consider at the margin, so typically 10%. Net transaction deposits averaged 150 million over that computation period. Average of 6.8 in vault cash. So let's go ahead and determine the minimum reserves to be maintained at the Fed. So here's a nice clear table. So we've got the 1250 in that second column, and then the next 6250, right, to get us up to 75, and then the next 75, that gets up to the 150. So let me just go back and remind you, right under the table, net transaction deposits for the bank averaged 150. So there are those 150 assigned to each of those marginal net accounts, right? So there's the reserve percentage, 0, 3, and 10. So you just do some quick multiplication, and that adds to a gross reserve requirement of 9,375. Subtract out the daily average vault cash, and you get a net reserve carry forward of 2.57, which then means we have minimum reserves to be maintained with the Federal Reserve. 2.57. So think about what that means as I'm a big picture guy. We have 150, and our minimum reserves is, what is that, about 2.5. Now, how about we take a look at that last learning objective, factors to consider when choosing the source of reserves. So factors to consider. So let's go ahead and close our eyes really quickly. Don't look at those factors, to cover a legal reserve deficit. So if we close our eyes, what do we need to think of? So my eyes are closed, or your eyes closed. What do we need to worry about? We need to worry about, okay, what are the rules out there? All right, I've opened my eyes. What are the rules out there? And then how does that relate to what's going on inside of our financial institution? And then what is the economic environment, right? So let's go ahead and look at these. Here are the factors. Immediacy of need, right? Is it me? Is it Jim making this deposit? Or is it James Bond making this deposit, right? And then what are the rules and regulations? All right. What's out there available for a liquidity source? How about the duration of need? Of course, what do we talk about? This is that whole discussion on asset liability management from our previous chapter. Access to the market, interest rate outlook, central bank monetary policy outlook. So those bottom two there, we're going to rely on the economists to try to help us out. And so those 6 factors, boy, there's at least 6 really good exam questions. I can envision a scenario where you have a question stem and say, all right, which factor is relevant to that specific question stem? And you could have different question stems, 6 of them, and then the correct answer would be one of these 6. And I think that takes us through those 5 learning objectives. I'm always tempted, like you guys, to focus on the calculate and the estimate, but those were relatively straightforward. So I'm guessing that you guys should be able to do that. Don't forget about that process to calculate the legal reserves, but I like that second one. Compare strategies that a bank can use to meet demands for additional liquidity.